It was a Sunday morning, June 1st, 1862. Elijah Coker woke up, got out of bed, and intended to spend the morning down by the creek on his property, accompanied by his wife Nancy and their 2 young children. Suddenly, shots rang out, the bullets ripping into the home. A band of armed men had appeared outside, seemingly out of nowhere. Nancy screamed for her husband to run. As he tried to escape out of the home on foot, a man named Ferguson overtook him on horseback and shot him. Coker threw up his arms and said something, but Nancy couldn't make out his words over the sound of the children screaming. Severely wounded, Elijah staggered to his feet under what must have been a rush of pure adrenaline. Shots continued to ring out as he ran toward a fence, some 50 yards from his home. With Ferguson and 9 other men in close pursuit, Elijah reached the fence. When he struggled to pull himself over it, Ferguson rode up close to him and shot him one more time. By the time Nancy reached the fence, their 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, had fought her way through the group of men to get to Elijah. She was kneeling next to his body, holding her daddy in her arms. She was covered in his blood. When Nancy reached Elijah, he gasped once, but never spoke. Nancy knelt beside her slain husband's body, the sounds of laughter emanating from the house, as Ferguson and his outlaw gang proceeded to ransack their home, taking the Coker's horse along with their valuables. This is the gruesome story of Champ Ferguson. The American Civil War is strangely named. It was far from civil by many accounts. The conflict is often presented as being fought with traditional armies, thousands of men dressed in blue and gray uniforms, charging across open fields, destroying each other while face to face in linear formations. While true, much of the war was also fought in the unconventional style of guerrilla warfare. To put it more precisely, a considerable amount of bloodshed that occurred during the conflict did not occur on the notorious battlefields. Americans, primarily those living in border states, were routinely being killed on their own properties, if not being murdered inside their very homes. While approximately 750,000 armed soldiers died between the Union and Confederacy, twice that number of total casualties, 1.5 million in all, including the wounded, have been reported. Unfortunately, with the passing of time, the number of civilian casualties has been far more difficult to calculate. Some sources have calculated civilian deaths at around 50,000. Nonetheless, considering the country's population was estimated at a mere 31.5 million at the time, the combined casualties of this war were significant. Many fighters among the guerrillas were sanctioned by neither the Union nor the Confederacy. They were considered lawless murderers. Unable to provide oversight for their crimes, and with these atrocities being committed by both Unionists and Confederate sympathizers, convictions for war crimes were scarce. Of the mere 2 individuals who were ultimately charged and executed for war crimes, One is a man considered the most notorious Confederate guerrilla fighter. While no amount of empirical digging can tell us more about this man than is recorded, the question remains, why would a mountain farmer, by all accounts a loving husband and father, torture, slaughter, and mutilate dozens of men, often in cold blood, men including his friends, members of his own family, unarmed boys, and helpless men as they lay in their beds? And once he was convicted, was he really executed? Or was there a conspiracy to save his life? Samuel Champ Ferguson grew up in the Cumberland Mountains of southern Kentucky, very near the border of northeastern Tennessee, the same region once inhabited by Davy Crockett. Before the Civil War, Ferguson was a farmer by trade for over 20 years. He liked to hunt, as hunting not only enabled him to get out into the mountains that he loved, but it was also a means of putting food on the table for his family. His long excursions gained him an intimate knowledge of the foothills and mountains, a knowledge that was to prove invaluable, enabling him to elude the Union guerrillas and federal soldiers who hunted him relentlessly for the duration of the war. Whether inherited from his father or derived from some other dark recesses of his mind, Champ's venomous behavior was apparently well known, even before the war, beginning with a reported incident in 1858. Early that year, a man named Floyd Evans apparently failed to pay his debt in the agreed-upon time after purchasing livestock from Champ. In anger, Champ then tracked down and ambushed Floyd's twin brother, Alex Evans, stealing his horse as payment. A horse was not only expensive, it was often vital to a man's survival and livelihood. Horse theft was considered a serious crime. Floyd eventually paid his debt in June. Alex Evans, however, maintained his lawsuit against Champ for the theft of his horse. The Evans brothers began speaking out publicly, which Champ considered to be a threat on his life. A warrant for Ferguson's arrest was issued by the Fentress County Court. Champ apparently feigned ignorance of his arrest warrant and continued traveling in and out of Fentress County. However, after attending a religious camp meeting in August, as he was leaving, the Fentress County Constable attempted to administer the arrest warrant on Champ. A group of men joined him in the effort. Seeing the growing crowd of men, Champ attempted to escape, mounting his young horse. The men gave chase, throwing rocks. Champ's horse stumbled, and he had to escape on foot. Constable Reed was the first to reach him. Champ quickly pulled out his pocket knife and began slashing the constable, stabbing him to death. Champ then wounded Floyd Evans, nearly killing him, and escaped into a nearby farmhouse. Under threat of death by the mob, however, he surrendered himself to the Fentress County Sheriff to receive a fair trial. The local magistrate, James Zachary Sr., ordered his imprisonment. He was imprisoned for 2 months before his family secured his bail, using a large amount of their land as a collateral payment. Champ secured a useful attorney, Scott Bledsoe. In fact, although it was scheduled for the following January, Champ's trial for the killing of Jim Reed would never happen. It is unclear how he did it, but evidently Bledsoe managed to repeatedly delay Champ's trial date. Before a trial could be held, nearly 3 years had passed, and the South had seceded from the Union. It is speculated that Scott Bledsoe's influence, or Champ's indebtedness for his services, provoked Champ to support the Confederacy in the mounting conflict. At the onset of the war, as the oldest of the Ferguson children, Champ now found himself at menacing odds with his 9 brothers and sisters, his mother, and most of his friends and neighbors, all of whom supported the Union and deeply resented his taking up the Southern cause. While the following explanation of American political controversy may not necessarily be exciting, as with any other conflict, understanding the social and political attitudes of the time appears somewhat necessary in understanding some of the root causes of Champ's murderous behavior. In the 1850s, the debate over whether slavery should be extended into new Western territories sparked controversy between the two major political coalitions, the Whig Party and the Democrat Party. Southern Democrats promoted the expansion of slavery in all territories, while their northern counterparts thought each territory should decide for itself. The Republican Party was founded in 1854, merely 7 years before the onset of the Civil War, created by a combined group of anti-slavery Whigs, members of the Know Nothing Party, and others. This new party garnered growing support around the nation, primarily in the North, having 2 of its presidential candidates elected to office immediately following its founding. Although wildly unpopular for his progressive views, Abraham Lincoln was the first to be elected, despite only receiving less than 40% of the popular vote. The debate over the future of slavery was a significant factor in rising tensions around the country. With the initial hope of avoiding violent conflict and preserving the Union, neither Lincoln nor many of his party members appear to have openly supported the idea of abolishing slavery, at least prior to the war. In some of his private correspondence, however, Lincoln acknowledged his disdain for the hypocrisy of living in a nation that abided by the immorality of slavery, as well as the controversial oppression of Irish immigrants and Catholics, when the nation had been founded on the belief that all men are created equal.
When it comes to this, I should prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for example, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy.
Abraham Lincoln's letter to Joshua Speed, 1855. Again, the initial conflict around slavery was not necessarily the abolishment of slavery, but the debate over whether slavery would be permitted in the newly developing territories as American settlers moved west, as forced labor was considered an unfair advantage by those farmers who did not own slaves. Despite his actual statements, election propaganda touted Lincoln as a total abolitionist, even despite his later efforts to mollify the southern states by preserving their constitutional right to maintain the practice of slavery. His election greatly divided an already unsettled nation, triggering the secession of southern states. As the war escalated, the Union Army was eager to consign any man willing to fight. Escaped and freed slaves were eager to fight, not only in defense of the Union, but for the freedom of their fellow slaves. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave himself, was perhaps the most recognized abolitionist of the time and served as an advisor to Lincoln. He reasoned with Lincoln on the fairness of these ideas of men willing to fight for their nation being granted equal rights in return for their service. Although there is more to the story than is covered here, Lincoln was swayed by Douglass's counsel. More than a year after the war began, in September of 1862, following the Union victory during the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, Lincoln presented the preliminary draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free those slaves residing in rebellious southern states, should the Union win the war. As such political conflict is clearly never a simple matter, it is important to note that not every Republican supported the abolition of slavery, and at least a small handful of Democrat Party members later voted in favor of it. In Southern minds, however, the entire Republican Party, those associated with it, and their voters quickly became known as abolitionists, despite not all Republican partisans supporting the move to end slavery. In Champ Ferguson's rural mountain community, which had few slaves, partisan loyalties likewise appear to have been less about complex debates and simply about choosing the winning side. Thus, they destroyed each other merely for their loyalty to a preferred party, regardless of the political nuances. In addition, it is presumed that Champ's family also worried that the unsettled debt, the significant payment of land paid to secure his bail, would be lost if he fought for the South. Conversely, Champ may have been promised immunity by Scott Bledsoe, with his charges being dropped by a victorious Confederate government. In any case, during the war, Champ reportedly broke into the Fentress County Courthouse and cut the pages concerning his killing of Constable Reed out of the minutes book, thus destroying the record of his crime. Although no proof exists for his involvement, those few pages were indeed discovered to be missing. 1861. Following Tennessee's decision to secede from the Union in June of 1861, East Tennessee quickly became a target for unofficial engagements between Union and Confederacy partisans. As demonstrated by Champ, even before the war began, bloody conflict had occasionally occurred in the area, the lack of established law and order giving way to mob justice and the cultural practice of family feuds. The most common sources of strife were livestock, women, politics, and thievery. However, the onset of the Civil War arguably became the greatest single cause for such divided sentiments. Appalachian mountain culture dictated a more elemental code of loyalty. When a man took sides in the mountains, all ties were cut, and all on the other side became enemies. Family feuding was thus carried out under the guise of war, and by the spring of 1862, the Cumberland Mountains were rife with violence. Non-enlisted Confederate supporters brawled with the local Union supporters far from the front lines. The eventual movement of Union troops into Tennessee further escalated the tensions in the region. Undoubtedly, Champ's hatred for Lincoln, the federal government, and anyone who supported the Union was causal to his eventual brutality against those he encountered. With his entire community seemingly against him, why did Champ Ferguson ultimately side with the Confederacy? Unfortunately, the reasons reported for his ruthless loyalty are shrouded in contradiction. Ferguson reportedly provided the most feasible explanation for why he entered the war supporting the South, though it is less romantic than the others, which is that he was a Union man up until making his release bargain after killing Constable Reed.
When the war broke out,
he later said,
I was induced to join the Army on the promise that all prosecution in that case would be abandoned, and this is how I came to take up arms.
Considering he had not enlisted at that time, it is speculated that his loyalty to Scott Bledsoe and the potential promise Bledsoe made regarding Champ being offered immunity for his service to the Confederacy is what he was referring to by this statement. Despite fighting primarily as an unauthorized guerrilla, Champ repeatedly defended his violent actions as those of a legitimate Confederate soldier. However, he was not officially conscripted into the Confederate Army until 1864, 3 years after the war had started, and he had already killed dozens of men. As for his initial loyalties to the Confederacy, further interviews after the war would have Champ indicate that his allegiances solidified following the Confederate victory at the Virginia Battle of Bull Run in the early summer of 1861. This victory evidently indicated to him that he had chosen the winning side. By late 1861, however, Champ Ferguson had begun a war of personal vendetta, preemptively killing any civilians, whether friend or family, which he believed supported the Union. The following is a quote from reporter James Johnson, The Nashville Dispatch, 22nd of October, 1865. The wounded, the sick, the aged, and even helpless childhood were not spared from his brutal murders. He thought, he says, that he was engaged in legitimate warfare.
We were having a sort of miscellaneous war up there through Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, and all through that region. Every man was in danger of his life. If I hadn't killed my neighbor, he would have killed me. Each of us had from 20 to 50 prescribed enemies, and it was regarded as legitimate to kill them at any time, at any place, under any circumstances, even if they were wounded or on a sick bed.
On December 2nd, Champ reportedly stole a horse at gunpoint from another local, nearly killing him for supposedly being a Lincoln supporter,
a damned Lincolnite.
Accompanied by 2 Confederate associates, he then rode the horse to the home of his old friend, Reuben Wood. A friend to the Ferguson family, Wood had known and cared for Champ since he was born. He had saved Champ's life, having intervened and preventing the mob from killing Champ after he stabbed the Fentress County constable to death. After the war began, Wood had found himself associated with the same Union company which Jim Ferguson, Champ's younger brother, had enlisted. Champ claimed the pair of them Champ sought to kill him, if given the opportunity. He and his Confederate associates met Wood on the road in front of Wood's home as Wood returned from feeding his animals. Wood was unarmed. According to Wood's daughter, Elizabeth, Champ spoke briefly with Wood, casually exchanging their usual compliments. Ferguson then abruptly said,
I suppose you've been to Camp Robinson.
It was not a question. Camp Robinson was a sore point for those who sided with the Confederacy, as they believed men were recruited there into the Home Guard, a group of local Union militia who defended the area. Wood truthfully acknowledged that he had. Ferguson asked what his business had been there, but before he could respond, according to Wood's daughter, Ferguson, using vile and bitter language, told him nobody but a damned old Lincolnite would be caught at any such place. After continuing this tirade for several minutes, Champ raised his pistol on Reuben. Don't you beg, Ferguson said, and don't you dodge. Wood's wife and daughter, now witnessing from the front of their home, begged Champ to spare his life. Reuben himself gave an impassioned plea, reminding Ferguson of their lifelong friendship, that he had nursed Champ as an infant.
Reuben, you have always treated me like a gentleman,
Ferguson responded.
But you have been to Camp Robinson, and I intend to kill you.
Ferguson pulled the trigger, hitting Reuben in the chest. Reuben Wood proved difficult to kill, however. Even fatally wounded, he managed to escape into his home. With his wife and 2 children helpless to save him, Reuben suffered for 2 days before he finally succumbed to his fatal injury. A month later, after the nearby Battle of Mill Spring in mid-January, Ferguson went looking for another old friend, William Frog. Esther Frog sat peeling apples on her front porch as Champ Ferguson arrived in front of the home on horseback, again with 2 other Confederate men in accompaniment. Mrs. Frog suspected no ill will. She had also known Champ since childhood. She kindly offered him a seat and an apple. Ferguson stepped onto the porch and, disregarding her invitation, walked purposefully into the home. William Frog lay sick in his bed, their 5-month-old child in a crib nearby. Like many of his other victims, Frog was unarmed. Unable to even raise himself from the bed, he weakly explained to his unexpected visitor that he had a relapse of the measles. Indeed, Union records show that he was on sick leave from his regiment, though he no doubt withheld that bit of information from Ferguson. Unfortunately, Ferguson already knew about his Union affiliation.
I reckon you caught the measles at Camp Dick Robinson,
Ferguson snarled as he raised his Colt revolver. Without another word, he squeezed the trigger twice as Frog feebly attempted to pull the covers over his face. As was his routine after such murders, before leaving, Champ ransacked the cabin, looking for weapons and other valuables. With Champ's pro-Unionist family and community already against his Confederate support, the cold-blooded murders of Frog and Wood, as well as his blatant theft of livestock and other crimes, roused the rest of the countryside against him. By this time, Champ's brother Jim had joined the Union's 1st Kentucky Cavalry as a scout, and the brothers had reportedly sworn to kill each other on sight, which no doubt would have happened had Jim not been ambushed and killed within a month of Reuben Wood's murder. After his father's murder, Reuben Wood's son, Robert, gathered a small band of armed men for the express purpose of killing Champ Ferguson. They missed their chance, as Champ quickly fled south across the border into secessionist Tennessee and joined a pro-Southern guerrilla band commanded by none other than his former attorney, Scott Bledsoe. Although Champ had since moved his family to Tennessee, he often returned to his home in Kentucky for his wartime exploits. Guerrilla fighting served as an alternative to military enlistment, permitting the participants to remain close to home, in familiar territory, throughout the war. The thought of justifiable violence and the lack of military custom appears to have attracted the more unhinged, bloodthirsty kind of men. Much of the brutal efficiency of the guerrilla was due to their lack of adherence to military custom, including their choice of weapons. The Colt pistol became a favorite among bushwhackers, as it offered a tactical advantage over rifles at close range. The clanking of sabers and carbine rifles against saddles could be heard over great distances at night. Stealth was one of the guerrillas' best tactics. Though more commonly sanctioned by Confederate authorities, guerrillas and anti-guerrilla bands existed on the Union side as well. As vicious in his defense of the Union as Champ was the Confederacy, a Fentress County man by the name of Dave Beatty would serve to become Champ's sworn enemy. Beatty was reportedly a nonpartisan civilian at the start of the war. Bledsoe's men later threatened Beatty's life if he refused to side with the Confederacy. Beatty responded to the threat in early 1862 by siding with the Union, raising his own band of guerrillas. His men lived in the woods, like Ferguson's, and practiced the same vicious tactics. Local legend tells of the time Beatty shot a man, and then directed his horse to step on the unfortunate victim's face. A local paper, the Nashville Dispatch, noted that Beatty fought Champ Ferguson from the beginning to the end of his career. They have shot at each other innumerable times, and each has received ugly wounds. They were deadly enemies and hunted each other down with savage ferocity. Beatty even testified against Champ during his post-war trial in 1865. Regardless of their loyalties, both Union and Confederate enlisted soldiers disparaged and shamed these partisan rangers, calling them bushwhackers, freebooters, or other dishonorable terms like carpet knights and featherbed soldiers, due to their apparent unwillingness to depart from the comfort of their homes and a warm bed. This, however, was not strictly true to form, as both prudent fighters and civilians left their homes during this period, lest they become an easy-to-find target. Champ Ferguson would indicate the legitimacy of this concern, as he seemed to delight in catching his enemies off guard, slaughtering many of his victims in their beds or just outside their homes. 1862. Throughout the 4 years of war, Ferguson went on to kill regular soldiers, members of the Home Guard, and simple farmers. He murdered helpless prisoners and the children of his perceived enemies. Although at times he used his pistol or rifle, he reportedly preferred to do his killing up close and personal with a Bowie knife. Further to these were rumors of decapitations and corpse desecration, such as the placing of severed heads or rolling them down hills for entertainment. Champ later attributed his use of a knife as his calling card to distinguish his kills. He purportedly put a notch in his knife handle after every kill, at least until he had to end this practice, since the handle had no space left to add more notches. In the early spring of 1862, towards the end of March, according to Union fighter Elijah Coker's third great-grandson, a meeting was held at Monroe, Tennessee, between a group of citizens from Overton County, Tennessee, representing the southern element of the war, and a group of citizens from Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, representing the northern element. Elijah had headed up a group of Home Guardsmen who kept watch over Clinton County. One of their jobs was to keep up with the whereabouts of Ferguson. Elijah's role in the Home Guardsmen would explain why he was one of the men chosen to work out the peace agreement at Monroe. The purpose of the meeting had been to reach a compromise whereby raiders would stop wreaking havoc in those three counties. The meeting was a success. The parties agreed not to conduct raids into any of the adjoining counties, but it would soon be evident that not everyone who attended the meeting wanted peace. Because he was one of the men responsible for most of the raids and most of the deaths, Ferguson was also at this meeting. What Elijah and the other Union representatives who attended the meeting at Monroe did not know was that Ferguson hated the Union side so much that just their presence at the peace agreement was enough for Champ to want to kill them. They would soon pay for trying to bring peace to the community. On April 1st, Champ and others among Bledsoe's men reportedly murdered 5 men in a single day in Fentress County. Among them were several men who had been counted among the Union representatives at the Monroe peace meeting. Joseph Stover, William Johnson, Robert Martin, and Lewis Pierce. By Champ's account, Stover was killed in a gunfight. Both Martin and Pierce were presumably unarmed and shot while running away, with Pierce being brought down with a double-barrel shotgun. Court documents indicate all three of their bodies were found both shot and stabbed through the heart. Johnson was a Union soldier home on leave at the time, staying with his father. He was chased over a bluff by Bledsoe's men, falling about 40 or 50 feet before being shot. Although he contested the circumstances of their deaths, Champ readily admitted to these killings, claiming that these men were Union home guards who sought to kill him. His last victim that day, however, was not a man per se, but a local youth named Fount Zachary. Near Spring Creek, Kentucky, he encountered the 16-year-old Zachary. Whether by misprint or journalistic sensationalism, the Nashville Dispatch later reported Fount to be as young as 12. Fount was the grandson of James Zachary Sr., the magistrate who had imprisoned Champ for killing Constable Jim Reed prior to the war. As with many of his other victims, Champ seized on the opportunity for revenge. was a Sunday morning. Give my voice some rest. It's so annoying that I can't. I gotta read through like friggin' 4 pages of text before my voice is like, oh, okay, yeah, I want to work for you now. Garbage. Okay. I really hate that. The combined casualties of this war were significant. I think I'm done. I like to read when I did it. There's no reason, just because my disturbing audio content. Listener discretion is advised. As the sun set on Tuesday, April 1st, 1862, less than a fortnight from the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, young Fount Zachary sat waiting on horseback, keeping watch along the road leading out of Albany, Kentucky, across the state's southern border into Tennessee. While Union and Confederate forces clashed around the nation, the teenagers' concerns were much closer to home. A band of guerrilla fighters were reported to have been conducting violent raids and ambushes in the area. Several men had already been murdered that same day. Fount, although 2 years underage at 16, had volunteered as a picket for the Home Guard, a group of local pro-Union militia, now positioned along the road as a lookout to give warning to the Union men if he should catch sight of the Confederate guerrilla band. Hearing the sounds of horses and men approaching, Fount gathered his reins and prompted his horse through the dense thicket onto the road to meet the oncoming group of Home Guardsmen. Shouldering his shotgun and approaching the cluster of men in the dim light, he proudly assured them that he had seen no guerrilla raiders passing through his sector. As the men drew closer, Fount suddenly realized his mistake. These men were not Home Guardsmen. Seeing his shotgun, one of the men approached Fount, demanding that the boy surrender it. He complied, handing his firearm to the man, and then beginning to remove his shot pouch from his shoulder. As he did so, another one of the men, a man named Champ Ferguson, approached him, asking for his name. Had he known who this man was, Fount might not have been so honest. As it was, Fount was the nephew, possibly grandson, of James Zachary, a local magistrate who, prior to the war, had once ordered Champ Ferguson's imprisonment to await his trial, after Champ had been convicted of stabbing the Fentress County constable to death. When he gave his name, Fount Zachary, Champ immediately pulled out his pistol and shot him. Fount fell from his horse onto the road. In his usual fashion, Champ then dismounted his own horse and approached the wounded boy, pulling out his Bowie knife. Kneeling down next to Fount, he then proceeded to stab him, driving the long blade into the boy's heart. This is part 2 of the gruesome story of Champ Ferguson. A lifelong farmer and resident of the Cumberland Plateau, a mountainous region along the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, at the onset of the American Civil War in 1861, Champ Ferguson was still awaiting his trial for the killing of the Fentress County Constable, Jim Reed, which occurred 3 years prior, when the constable had attempted to administer an arrest warrant for Champ's reported horse thievery. With his family posting much of their valuable land to secure his bail, Champ was released to await his trial. Although it is unclear how, his young attorney, Willis Scott Bledsoe, managed to obtain multiple continuances of the prosecution against him, with Champ's trial being delayed beyond the onset of the war. Now, as an irregular partisan fighter, like many other Union and Confederate men who chose not to formally enlist during the Civil War, Champ took full advantage of the conflict to settle old grudges, tracking down and killing his perceived enemies, even his friends and family members, and defending his acts of apparent self-preservation as being those of a soldier's duty. According to author and history professor Brian D. McKnight, in his book Confederate Outlaw, whether Champ felt indebted to Bledsoe or his attorney manipulated him into joining his company with the promise of legal protection within the new Confederate nation, Ferguson enlisted, thus beginning what may have been the bloodiest single career of the Civil War. Despite the majority of battles and skirmishes taking place far from the Cumberland Plateau, Kentucky and Tennessee locals found themselves living in constant terror of the seemingly inexhaustible Union and Confederate guerrilla raiding and violence taking place throughout the region. Around March of 1862, a meeting had been organized between both Union and Confederate representatives at Monroe, Tennessee, in order to broker a deal to return some measure of peace and security to the area. In attendance were local home guardsmen known to Champ, Tinker Dave Beatty, James Zachary, Thomas Wood, and Elijah Coger, among others. Allegedly, although he had already marked these men for death for their Union affiliation, their attendance at this meeting gave Champ a renewed vendetta against them. Despite the opportunity for peace and stability, according to author Brian McKnight, Confederate Captain James McHenry, a guerrilla leader, refused to abide by the gentleman's agreement. Guerrilla raiding thus returned in full to Clinton County, Kentucky, within days of the meeting at Monroe. Under Captain McHenry's command, Champ and his band of guerrilla fighters killed 4 men in Clinton County on April 1st, with the 5th being Champ's murder of young Found Zachary. Champ later contended during his trial in 1865 that he had shot the boy the moment he emerged from the thicket, claiming he had been ordered by his Confederate commander, Jim McHenry, to shoot any person seen carrying a gun. One of Champ's own men, John A. Capps, attested to the account of Found's murder.
As soon as he said his name, Ferguson shot him. He fell from his horse, and Ferguson then walked over and stabbed him. I was within 10 or 15 feet of him, and when Ferguson stabbed him, I heard a sort of rough, grating sound that I hardly know how to describe. We left the body lying there.
Under cross-examination, Capps likewise attested that McHenry's orders did not include the instruction to shoot anyone who surrendered their firearms. Champ's own mother-in-law, Widow Owen, was the one to recover the boy's body from the road and keep it in her home nearby until his family arrived to claim him. Unfortunately for the Zachary clan, Fount would be only the first of 4 of his family members to die on Ferguson's account. By springtime of 1862, Champ Ferguson's name had become synonymous to locals when referring to the unrestrained behavior of guerrilla fighters. Ferguson's use of a knife in his killings would no less become fabled in pro-Union propaganda circles, with his killing of Fount being portrayed as Fount having his arms held firmly by Champ's men, as Ferguson ran his blade across the boy's abdomen, spilling his entrails into the dirt. While such embellished stories horrified many, they likewise received praise from Champ's supporters around the country. Although pro-Union writers would certainly seek to portray Champ as villainous, many of his verified murders of innocent and unarmed men, as well as his total death count, estimated at nearly 120 men by the end of the war, did nothing to salvage his otherwise merciless reputation. Shortly after his first raid in April, culminating with the death of Found Zachary, Ferguson and his men narrowly escaped capture by Union Colonel Frank Wolford and the enlisted men of the 1st Kentucky Cavalry, the same unit Champ's brother Jim had enlisted with prior to his death. A raid was conducted on the guerrilla leader's campsite, but evidently Champ had been given advanced warning of the attack and escaped. The next day, in a brazen attempt to learn more about his enemy by deception, Champ and one of his companions donned stolen blue uniforms and approached a squad of Wolford's men as they searched for Champ. Unfortunately for him, he was recognized. His companions surrendered, but Champ took off, the following chase nearly costing him his life before he abandoned his horse and fled into the dense underbrush. On May 2nd, Ferguson again accompanied Scott Bledsoe on another raid into Kentucky. Yet again, the opportunity for revenge arrived. One of his first stops on this raid was the home of Alexander Huff, a cousin of Champ's mother. Although once friendly with each other, Champ's relationship to the Huff family had soured soon after the war began. The family patriarch, Alexander, had been one among the group of Union militia who had captured Champ the previous year as he traveled down the road. They then attempted to escort him to Camp Dick Robinson to force his enlistment into the Union Army, before Champ managed to escape. This is evidently when Champ decided that he could no longer remain a non-combatant civilian. and joined Scott Bledsoe's guerrilla band. Around Christmas the previous year, following his cold-blooded murders of his Unionist friends Reuben Wood and William Frobe, Champ had conversely captured Alexander's son, Preston Huff. He then became furious when he realized the Confederate officials had soon released his prisoner. As Preston departed the Confederate camp, Champ nearly killed him in front of several Confederate soldiers who stopped him. Champ resorted instead to stealing Preston's horse and threatening to kill him if he did not return to his home and remain there. Preston apparently tested Ferguson's patience by replying,
"Well, I'll try, but it will be very hard to do. A man is bound to travel about sometimes."
At this, Champ let him go, but with the promise that he intended to teach the Huff family a hard set of lessons, announcing his intention to kill several of them. Now, less than 5 months later, Champ arrived at the Huff family home. During his later trial, Lucinda Huff recounted,
"My father was sitting in the yard. He went into the house, then Jewett McGinnis told my father to come out and push John Smith forward to shoot him. Mother and myself caught hold of Smith and told him not to kill father. Champ said he shouldn't be hurt, for me to go back in the house and go do my work. They took my father away. We later found him at the old Conrad Pile's place."
Interestingly, the Huff's nearest neighbor, Conrad Pile, was the nephew of a woman by the name of Delilah. Delilah was the wife of William Crockett, son of Davy Crockett. Even further, Conrad Pile's great-nephew was another well-known Fentress County resident, Sergeant Alvin York, a Medal of Honor recipient for his single-handed capture of 132 German soldiers during World War I, some 50 years later. During Champ's later trial, William B. Williams likewise testified regarding the death of Alexander Huff.
"I had started the mill that morning, but met some pickets, Flem McGinnis and one of McDaniel's boys, Jonathan, I think it was, and they arrested me and carried me to the Conrad Pile's place. After we'd been there a short while, arsenal men brought in Alex Huff, Ferguson being in the group. They sent out some pickets, and before long we heard some shooting in the direction the pickets had gone. And at this, the soldiers seemed to get scared and, hurrying out of the house, mounted their horses and made up the road in the direction they first came. Ferguson, however, lagged behind, and when it was found out that the alarm was caused by a false report, Ferguson called a halt. I was standing on the porch by Huff at the time, and the first thing I knew is I heard Ferguson tell me to get out of the way. I was standing between Huff and the edge of the porch, and when we looked around, we saw that Ferguson had a pistol in his hand. He said to me again, 'Get out of the way.' Huff sort of raised his hands and said, 'For God's sake, don't shoot me,' then dashed into the door and through the house. Ferguson took out around the lower end of the house, shouting as he went, 'Shoot him, damn him, shoot him.' I ran into the house and into a room upstairs where I stayed for some time, seeing nothing more of the proceedings."
Williams listened to the following sounds of gunfire and Alexander's screams. The firing of guns lasted for several minutes, with the sounds of Alexander's mingled cries of pain and desperate prayers continuing after the gunfire ceased. Suffering over a dozen bullet wounds, Alexander had crawled under an apple tree, still alive but covered in blood and agonizing in the throes of death, deliriously begging for a drink of water. One of the neighbors, Nancy Brooks, began tending to Alex before Ferguson ordered one of his men, Smith, to shoot him again. Despite onlookers' protests, Smith then ended Alexander's life, firing the last shot into the center of his skull. According to Brian McKnight, the time lapse between the first shots and the last was anywhere between 15 and 30 minutes, with Brooks's testimony adding an air of methodical viciousness to the crime. Apparently, Ferguson and his men intentionally avoided killing Huff right away, preferring instead to watch the man suffer for a while before finally dispatching him. Ferguson later denied any responsibility for the killing of Alexander Huff, although eyewitness testimonies discredited this claim. Ferguson likewise inadvertently contradicted himself in an interview for the Nashville Union, as he was quoted saying, "Alex Huff was killed by myself and some of my men." Several days later, on May 4th, General John Hunt Morgan's Confederate cavalry, while passing through Tennessee on their way to Kentucky, stopped overnight in Lebanon. Evidently, a combination of poor weather and complacency on the part of his command left them vulnerable, as Colonel Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry charged into the town the following morning, taking the Confederates by surprise. Scattering to the outskirts of Lebanon, John Morgan and some of his men managed to escape the attack, fleeing across the Cumberland River in a route now known as the Lebanon Races. He later recouped about 70 of his original 300 men. Being in unfamiliar territory, and with his loss of troops, Morgan then enlisted the aid of the local Confederate guerrillas, including Champ. Morgan's men reportedly crowded around Ferguson, eager to get a glimpse of the notorious outlaw whose exploits were becoming a legend in the region. With the addition of guerrilla men, those led by Bledsoe and Captain Oliver B. Hamilton, as well as a small handful of Ferguson's men, the Confederate force more than doubled in size. With the aid of the guerrillas' knowledge of the area, Morgan and his men moved towards the city of Bowling Green, although the sounds of horns marked their movement north, as Home Guard lookouts warned local Unionists of the enemy soldiers' approach. On May 11th, Morgan's men captured 2 trains. The first had each of its 49 boxcars set ablaze, then being sent flying down the rails southward to Nashville, resulting in a tremendous explosion. Morgan found the second train to be mostly full of women passengers. Treating them kindly as a gentleman, Morgan left this train intact, confiscating $6,000 from the express agent and taking several Union officers and enlisted soldiers as prisoners. As Ferguson never appears to have truly established an official conscription into the Confederate Army, his proximity to Morgan now presented an opportunity for him to later legitimize his irregular violence. He attached himself to Morgan's and other Confederate companies several times throughout the rest of the war. However, he continued to shift between irregular and formal warfare, often violating the customary rules of war. For the last weeks in May, Ferguson appears to have taken a quiet break from his raiding, returning to his home in White County, Tennessee. His next actions began on May 29th in Albany, as he and his men reportedly killed a Mr. Story, as reported by a Mr. Long, possibly John Long, a farmer who had witnessed the murder. His next murder would be that of Elijah Coger. Shortly after the guerrilla raiding had begun the previous year, prudent fighters such as Hiram Markham spent their nights sleeping outside their homes, often in nearby fields of corn or other vegetation, to avoid being caught inside their homes at night by enemy patrols. On one night the previous year, Markham was alerted to the presence of a Confederate patrol by the screams of his wife and daughters. According to the account cited by Brian McKnight, one of the men remained behind, hoping to perpetrate a crime against the women. Although he severely wounded one of Markham's daughters, Hiram was able to get into the house and kill him before the attack proceeded further. The Home Guard commander, Elijah Coger, likewise maintained a practice of spending the warmer months lying out in the mountains to keep away from rebel guerrillas. Now 2 months after the peace meeting in Monroe, Tennessee, Champ evidently learned of Elijah Coger's return to his home. On the morning of June 1st, Champ and a band of about 9 of his men went to find him, arriving at his home and catching Coger off guard. Preston Huff, along with several Union men who had been scouting the area to find Champ, later claimed to have witnessed this murder. Considering how quickly Coger was killed after the shooting had started, there is some speculation that Preston may have misrepresented his witnessing the event, as he gave testimony during Champ's trial in an effort to assist in the prosecution of his father's killer. There is no doubt, however, that he did visit the Cogers' home shortly following the murder.
Louis DeBall, Jonathan Williams, and Theophilus Williams were with me. We heard several guns fire and went out to the road to see what they were shooting at. We heard the women at Elijah Coger's house screaming and saw some man who was climbing over a fence fall backwards. When the men had left Coger's place, we went up to the house. The man's shot turned out to be Elijah Coger. His little girl was clinging to him, and she was very bloody, presenting a horrible sight.
Champ Ferguson regarded his killing of Elijah as a good riddance of bad rubbish. The very same day, Champ paid a visit to the farm of the aforementioned James Zachary, the Ventris County magistrate who had remanded Ferguson to jail to await trial prior to the war, and who was also a Union Home Guard member that was present with Elijah Coker at the Monroe Peace meeting. Whether for his indictment, his Union affiliation, or the threat of Ferguson's murder trial being resurrected by Zachary after the war, Champ caught Zachary outside his home, then chasing him through the orchard on his property. Zachary's daughter Esther stood listening on the porch. Unlike Coker, James Zachary had always kept his Colt Navy revolver on his person. Unfortunately, he appears to have dropped it during the chase. Esther heard the shots that ended her father's life, and Champ's accomplices telling him. Esther later stated that her father's head had been repeatedly shot and looked like jelly. Returning to the home, Champ walked onto the porch, leveling his pistol at Esther's dog, which she quickly pulled away, promising him the dog wouldn't bite. Champ frankly announced,
"We've killed your father,"
before beginning to search the house, later retracing Zachary's steps through the orchard to find Zachary's Colt Navy pistol, and stopping to remove a single silver spur from the dead man's boot. Although less is known about many of Champ's killings, along with those he had killed on April 1st, several other Union men who also attended the Monroe Peace meeting, those by the name of Taylor, Dalton, and McDonald, would similarly die by Ferguson's hand. After his killing of James Zachary, Ferguson appeared to soon reattach himself to John Hunt Morgan's cavalry, moving with the Confederate force during raids, destroying whatever supplies they couldn't carry away, and helping the cavalry retake the previously lost city of Lebanon in early July. Again, despite his lack of an official military enlistment, these actions later warranted his war record a greater sense of legitimacy. However, by August of 1862, Champ had again split off from the main party and refocused himself on personal vendettas. On 2 more occasions, he again stopped at the farm of Elijah Coker, the first being when he and his men imposed on the dead man's family for an afternoon meal. Although Ferguson left shortly after, a Confederate company of about 200 men spent the night, and according to Nancy Coker, destroyed nearly everything I had. His next known killing was that of Joseph Beck, whose body was discovered after Ferguson had stopped by the Coker home again, telling Nancy Coker and her sister that he had killed the man and left his body lying in the road within a mile of their home. From here, author Brian McKnight deduces that while the larger war played out on the battlefields of Kentucky, Champ Ferguson's guerrilla war continued in the mountains. Meanwhile, as Confederate forces advanced into the region, Confederate guerrillas operated in the southern part of the state with impunity. Civilian reports poured into the governor's office, citing repeated Confederate raids occurring through nearby Burkesville. Union officers began sending scouting parties, including Lieutenant Preston Huff's company, into the region, hunting for rebel guerrillas. Several of these parties exchanged gunfire with Ferguson and his men. Despite the obvious risks, Preston unfortunately took time to visit his home while he was scouting the area. Siblings John Huff and Lucinda Hatfield, maiden name Huff, both testified in the trial against Ferguson, first for the murder of their father, Alexander Huff, the previous year, as well as for the following murders of Union soldiers William Delk, John Crabtree, and John Williams. Both the men's Union affiliation and Champ's grudges against them appear to have been his motive. Burial records indicate that the 3 men were otherwise related to each other and to the Pyle, Huff, and Crockett families by marriage and direct bloodlines, which may have aroused Champ's feudal reasons for killing them. Ferguson and about a dozen of his men again arrived at the Huff home, this time under the cover of morning darkness on October 3rd. The men surrounded the home, with Champ waking the occupants by shouting for Preston to come out and surrender, Preston being his intended target. Preston later recounted that upon hearing the arrival of Champ's men, he and William had slipped out of the house in the darkness and escaped into a nearby cornfield, where they remained hidden and observed the following events. not wishing to give Champ the opportunity to follow through on his promise to kill them. Young John Huff, about 16 at the time, lit a fire and was ordered not to move again under threat of death. Ferguson questioned him about who was in the house, specifically asking about Preston and Andrew Huff. Possibly unaware that Preston and William had escaped, John honestly stated that William Delk, John Crabtree, John Williams, William Huff, and Preston Huff were there, and that Andy Huff was not there. While the men sat in the dark house awaiting their fate, Delk walked outside to face the group, asking what would be done with them. Ferguson placated his fears, assuring his safety, and that they would be transported to Albany as prisoners to be tried for unspecified charges. At this, the other two men surrendered as well. After exiting the home, while some of Champ's men began to ransack the house, the three prisoners' arms were tied behind their backs with rifle straps. Delk begged the men not to tie him so tight, as the leather bindings were painful. Ferguson snorted, "Damn you, that's what we want to do." When Preston and William were not found in the house, Champ grew angry and threatened Lucinda that he would burn her house if she did not relate to him where her brother and cousin were. Champ assured her that when he caught Preston, he intended to dismember every joint in his body and throw the pieces so far apart that her family would never find them to bury them. Ferguson told his men to take what they pleased, and they did, taking all the money, valuables, and clothing they could find. They even took the bullet-riddled and blood-stained jacket that had been worn by Alexander Huff when he was murdered. The prisoners' pockets were also searched. When money was taken from the now tied-up Delk, Ferguson smiled wryly and assured him that he would have no further use for money. In addition to the valuables they had stolen, according to young John Huff,
Champ then took a slave girl, saying she belonged to Eli Hatfield, and he had orders to take her. The girl belonged to Hatfield, who was a brother-in-law of mine. My mother had raised the girl.
It is unknown what Champ did with the girl, but despite his statement, among his other exploits, Champ was known to capture and sell slaves for personal profit. At daylight, as they started from the house with the young girl and their three tied prisoners, Crabtree's mother asked Ferguson,
"You ain't gonna kill him, are you?"
Ferguson then drew his knife and, pointing it menacingly at William, assured her son that he was going to cut his throat with that very knife. Crabtree's mother begged for her boy's life to be spared. Champ told her it was too late now, that she ought to have made him do better long ago. Upon leaving the home, John Huff later recalled,
I got about 100 yards from the house, and I saw the light of 2 or 3 guns, whereupon I went into the house and heard about 12 or 13 guns. Heard someone say 2 or 3 times, "Run."
Less than 45 minutes from the time that the men had left the house, young John and the 3 women walked to the Pyle family's home. As with their father, here they found the lifeless bodies of Delk, Williams, and Crabtree, sprawled in the horse lot. Williams was shot about the center of the forehead, a piece of his skull blown off. Delk was shot once through his chest, with either a bayonet or knife run through it. Crabtree suffered the worst, as he had no gunshot wounds, but appeared to have been tortured to death. 28 stab wounds were found on his body by counting the holes in his coat. With his arms still tied, Crabtree's chest, shoulder, neck, and collarbone had been repeatedly slashed. On his back was a deep laceration under the left shoulder blade, into which Ferguson or his men, one of which was Crabtree's own cousin, appeared to have stuffed corn stalks, possibly while Crabtree was still alive. Kneeling next to her son's senselessly mutilated body, Crabtree's mother gently removed them. Champ said little about Williams, but frankly admitted to shooting Delk. His patent justification for Delk's murder was that he had long hunted Champ, and he had to kill him to save his own life. While he denied torturing him, Champ's words regarding Crabtree were more bizarre, claiming not only self-preservation, but that he also knew the man to be a Union spy, and that federal generals were similarly justified in executing spies. Champ again appeared to contradict his original statements during press interviews with the Nashville Dispatch, as he later stated that he did not kill Delk, but admitted to stabbing Crabtree, ironically claiming that Crabtree was a murderous villain and had went to men's houses and shot them to get their money. After leaving the Piles place, Ferguson and his men entered Wayne County, Kentucky, and encountered a group of men and women led by a man named Silas Upchurch. Ordering Upchurch to remove his family from the group, while two men, a white man named Offie Orf Williams and a black man named Johnson's Granville, were called out. These two men had merely fallen in line with the larger family group as they traveled down the road. One of Champ's men ordered Williams to hand over his guns. Upon doing so, he was immediately shot and killed. The band then tied Granville's arms, leading him about 100 yards off the road, before shooting him as well. Silas later recounted that he watched from the road as Ferguson began mutilating the man's chest and neck with his knife, later wiping the man's blood off on his own trousers. Champ then proceeded to the Upchurch farm, where he stole 10 of their horses. His later comments regarding these two murders were that he knew the men to be Union scouts in search of his guerrilla party. While the Nashville Union reported that Granville was a Union soldier, this could not be verified. Orf Williams, however, may well have been a Union home guard. Sadly, he may very well have also been the father of Champ's murder victim, John Williams, from that very same morning. Although less is known about why Conrad Pyle was taken prisoner a month later, possibly his family's or his own support of the Union, evidently he was taken from his home on November 24th, then led along the road about 2 miles, before he was shot 13 times and slashed across his body with a knife, left dead in the road. As Union forces moved back into the Cumberland region, like Preston Huff, George and William Thrasher were soldiers with Wolford's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. They similarly requested time off to visit their father. On the afternoon of October 27th, Champ and 22 soldiers in his group ambushed and arrested the two brothers. The following morning, Ferguson sat with William, engaging him in a conversation about the recent death of James Zachary, and what William, being a soldier in the same unit as Zachary's sons, knew about the killing. Apparently, according to William, Ferguson was upset to hear that Zachary's death had been credited to one of his men, Fayette Allen. Champ snorted in disgust, claiming responsibility for Zachary's death for himself. As they later transported the prisoners to a place of holding, they happened across the farm of Washington Tabor, whom Champ regarded to be a Union bushwhacker. George Thrasher later recalled,
I looked up and saw Tabor coming up the lane on a horse. When he saw Tabor, Ferguson dismounted and went toward him, accusing him of ambushing and killing 3 of his men. When Tabor got off his horse as Ferguson drew near, Ferguson soon brought Tabor up to where we were, and he was pleading for his life. Oh yes, said Ferguson, you oughtn't to die. You have done nothing to die for. All while he was getting his pistol out of his belt. While the old man was begging for his life, Ferguson shot him through the heart and in the body. He fell after the second shot.
According to Thrasher, one of Champ's men encouraged him to shoot Tabor one more time. At this, Champ put his final bullet in the man's skull. Shortly before Tabor's wife and daughter came running from the nearby house, screaming and crying. Tabor's body was left lying in the road as Ferguson and his men continued their journey with the Thrasher brothers in tow. They had not gone more than a mile when they were suddenly ambushed by Union guerrilla Elam Huddleston and about 80 of his men. Champ's group of 20 men was greatly outnumbered. If there was one Unionist who was a thorn in Ferguson's side other than Dave Beatty, it was Elam Huddleston. In fact, both Beatty and Huddleston frequently joined forces. Elam had also been counted among the mob that attacked Champ before the war, resulting in the death of Constable Reed. The gun battle that ensued is possibly the biggest skirmish that occurred in Clinton County during the Civil War. Ferguson had previously instructed his men that if any skirmish came up, to be sure and immediately kill their prisoners, the Thrasher brothers. Luckily, during the confusion of the attack, George and William managed to escape. Although contested by Ferguson, he may have managed one more personal killing by the end of November. Dr. McGleisen, lived in Cumberland County, Kentucky, and it has been indicated that he believed his brother was killed by Ferguson. He had since made public his desire to have Ferguson prosecuted. Ferguson reportedly found McGleisen at his home, forcing him out at gunpoint before telling him to run for his life before killing him as he ran. Champ denied this, but otherwise admitted to shooting a man he didn't know, killing him as the man attempted to escape down a bluff and over a fence. With his death count as a guerrilla leader rising, by the middle of December of 1862, Champ Ferguson and his men were proving themselves of more than an ordinary annoyance to the Federals in that region. Christmas found Champ further north in Kentucky, again with Morgan's Raiders, where he was provided the opportunity to avenge himself of the Unionist guerrilla attack that occurred 2 months prior. Having requested 2 companies of Morgan's Raiders to join him, Champ rode 40 miles on a cold New Year's night, arriving in front of Elam Huddleston's cabin shortly before midnight and quietly encircling the house. One account of this incident appears embellished or misremembered some years later in a diary entry, as one of the Confederate men, John Weatherred, recounted that upon arriving to the house, Champ broke in the door, then rushing inside and taking Elam by surprise, stabbed him before he could rise from his cot, with Champ then dragging him outside and slitting his throat in the yard. A less sensational version of this story is as follows. Those inside the home only realized the danger when Moses Huddleston, Elam's brother, awoke to see Ferguson looking in at him through the glass. Ferguson then shouted, waking the rest of the occupants. Moses, Elam, and their cousin David ran upstairs to retrieve their guns. Weatherred further stated that, despite offering Elam the opportunity to surrender, the men began firing on the Confederate soldiers from the upper floor. A full-scale gun battle ensued, with the women and children cowering on the ground floor, trying to avoid the bullets flying through the home, as well as smothering the fires which Ferguson's men attempted to start to smoke the family out. Within an hour, Elam had been seriously wounded. Hoping to save his brother's life, Moses called out, asking to surrender. One of the Confederate officers guaranteed their safety if the men exited the home. Evidently, Ferguson ignored this, as Moses later recounted that when he pulled his wounded brother outside, Ferguson immediately drew his pistol and shot Elam as they lay him on the ground. In any case, Champ got what he wanted. Elam Huddleston was dead. While some of the more sympathetic Confederate soldiers helped the women smother a fire near the back door, Ferguson's men began looting the house, one of them even attempting to search Elam's widow before being stopped by a major from Morgan's command in his effort to stop a potential sexual crime. Before leaving with their 2 prisoners, Moses and David, some of the Confederate men helped carry Elam's body back into the house, out of respect for his widow. 1863. Later calling the 2 men to the front of the column, Ferguson inquired as to the whereabouts of 2 other local Unionists, Captain John Morrison and Rufus Doughty. Possibly out of fear of being executed as Elam had, they led Champ to the nearby Doughty residence. Although Rufus was not home that night, Champ unexpectedly discovered other men spending the night at the home. 2 men whom he had also sworn to kill, both by the name of Peter Allen Zachary. Sharing the same name, the older of these 2 men was both the brother of James Allen Zachary and the father of Fount Zachary, both of whom Champ had already murdered. Peter Jr. was his nephew, being the deceased James Zachary's son. Both men would have undoubtedly killed Champ if given the opportunity. Despite Weatherred's sensational account of Champ slitting both men's throats before they could get up from their beds, Sarah Doughty testified that Champ and his men ordered the front door open before barging in. Peter Jr. raised his pistol and fired on Ferguson, missing his only shot, before Ferguson grabbed the pistol and they began to scuffle. Gunshots rang out as Sarah screamed at them not to shoot inside the house. Allen Sr. attempted to make a break for the door, but was gunned down as he crossed the threshold. Freeing himself from Ferguson, Peter Jr. likewise ran for the door as Ferguson held onto his shirt tail, striking at him with something, probably his knife. The fight continued out in the yard, with Moses Huddleston later approaching the yard at Ferguson's request, watching as Ferguson wiped a bloody knife across Peter Jr.'s chest. In a statement after his trial, Ferguson recalled,
I killed Peter Zachary after one of the most desperate struggles that I ever had in my life. One of my men killed Allen.
Upon reaching General John Morgan's camp, Moses and David were taken as prisoners, but immediately paroled and released to their home the following day. Seeking to boast about his recent expedition, Champ later visited with an injured Confederate acquaintance and Morgan's brother-in-law, Colonel Basil Duke. Apparently, the colonel had been wounded early in the gunfight the night before and missed most of the action. Champ proudly showed him his knife, still covered in dried blood. Duke recalled that the combination of the story and the knife thoroughly nauseated him. An easy target for pro-Union propagandists, Champ's name was gaining significant notoriety in military and political circles. Throughout early 1863, Union commanders redoubled their efforts, sending scout units into the highlands in an effort to find and capture Ferguson and his band. Ferguson's private feuds were thus suspended for some time after this, due to his prolonged entanglements with the Federal Army. The following is an excerpt from Brian McKnight's book, which seeks to outline Ferguson's view of the war and the public perception of his and Morgan's actions, which often rejected military discipline and gave way to blatantly criminal acts such as bank robbery and armed theft of private citizens. To Ferguson, he, along with Morgan and Basil Duke, were three Kentucky expatriates attempting not only to save the state for the Confederacy, but also to defend their homes and families from what they considered foreign aggressors. On a more pragmatic level, the pursuit of wealth and power also drove Ferguson and Morgan. The fact that both men were considered martyrs for the Southern cause during the post-war years helped elevate the level of respect given them and quieted dissenting voices. With the passage of time, however, historians have been more willing to promote evidence over emotion. Ferguson's habit of stealing money, guns, horses, and clothes is well documented in this study. During the first 4 months of 1963, Champ's name appears almost absent from any records, with the one exception being a letter by J.O. of Lebanon sent to the Louisville Daily Journal, in which J.O. attributed Champ Ferguson and company to the deaths of 50 citizens of Clinton County, after the Union Army had conscripted the majority of fighting-age men into military service, leaving the area defenseless. Over the next 2 years, Ferguson's guerrilla band, which now numbered in the dozens and sometimes in the hundreds, would harass Union forces, occasionally augmenting other Confederate cavalry regiments, as Morgan's command was inevitably hounded north into Ohio, before Morgan surrendered his command to Union forces on July 26, 1863, outside the small village of West Point, Ohio. Ferguson appears to have rested in Sparta, Tennessee, during much of the summer months, as the war escalated in the surrounding regions. He is next known to have augmented Confederate Colonel George G. Debrow's 8th Tennessee Cavalry and possibly a Confederate command under Colonel John Hughes. A letter dated October 24, 1863, written by a one MDC, places Ferguson in Greensburg and Munfordville, Kentucky, during what would become known as the Munfordville Raid. According to the letter, Champ and his band of Southern guerrillas arrived after dark and commenced immediately to rob and pillage. Although they began the raid by breaking into a Union man's house, by the time they left the town, they had evidently stolen approximately $14,000 worth of goods and valuables from even Confederate sympathizers. The writer additionally noted that the group stopped to rob private citizens, including one man from whom they took 11 cents, being too chivalrous to insult him by giving it back. A similar raid was conducted in Adair County, with the bandits indiscriminately robbing everyone they could find walking the streets, without concern for their partisanship or status. The reporting correspondent stated that slaves were harassed as freely as was the son-in-law and Secretary of State of former Governor Beriah McGoffin, a man with well-known Confederate sympathies. Surprisingly, eyewitnesses reported Champ as being the most well-behaved of the group. However, towards the end of November of 1863, Union military leaders continued issuing complaints and requests for additional support in quelling the ongoing guerrilla violence against civilians and the raiding of much-needed supplies in the region. 1864. By this time in the war, guerrilla fighters were well known. While some respected them for their efficiency, they were conversely detested by most senior officers of both the Union and Confederate armies. Charged with rooting out these irregular soldiers, with Champ Ferguson being their main target, in February of 1864, Federal Colonel William B. Stokes sent word to all known bushwhackers that he would offer no quarter or mercy to these criminals. Oddly enough, according to author Brian McKnight, Colonel Stokes was, in many ways, the anti-Champ Ferguson, having been a supporter of secession prior to the war, but instead choosing to remain loyal to the Union at the onset of the war. Unsurprisingly, despite their irregular status, guerrilla leaders took great issue with these surrender exclusions. As men like Champ Ferguson would demonstrate, their matter of recourse would be unspeakable butchery levied against captured Union soldiers and officers. Union raids of guerrilla homes resulted in the recoupment of many stolen horses, weapons, and supplies, with Federals confiscating a number of horses and valuable items from Ferguson's Tennessee property on 2 occasions in January. Finding no sign of Ferguson or several other notorious guerrillas near Sparta, Union forces turned their attention towards an invasion of the Cumberland region of Tennessee and Kentucky to root them out. During these movements, Union reports indicate that civilians in the region were on the brink of famine, with guerrilla raiding having greatly diminished food stores and other needed supplies of the locals, without regard for partisanship. Many Unionists and Confederate supporters alike were nearing poverty and starvation. On February 13, 1864, now back in Tennessee with Colonel Stokes on his heels, Ferguson and several men arrived on the farm of Isham Richards in Fentress County, having some idea that 3 Unionist men, Jackson Garner, James Templeton, and Tinker Dave Beatty's son, Dallas Beatty, were on the property. A witness to the murder, a man named Columbus German, later testified that having found Dallas hiding behind a woodpile, Ferguson chillingly made Beatty look down the barrel of his gun and asked him if he would like to eat the powder just before he pulled the trigger. Ferguson then approached the home, ordering Jackson Garner outside. Apparently, a member of the household requested that Ferguson not kill Garner inside the house to avoid the mess, to which Ferguson angrily threatened to kill the man if he dared question him again. With Garner now standing on the porch, Ferguson then shot him twice. Templeton was taken prisoner, and no testimony was uncovered regarding his fate. Responding to Colonel Stokes' issuance of a no-surrender policy for guerrillas, the Battle of Dug Hill began as an ambush, with Ferguson and a Confederate force trapping 60 of Stokes' Union men on the road in a steep gorge. Along with gunfire, heavy rocks were thrown down on the men, with some among the survivors reportedly having their throats cut from ear to ear. Of the approximately 110 men, less than 50 managed to scatter into the hills and escape. Champ's later indictment would indicate that as many as 19 of the soldiers who attempted to surrender in Dug Hill were later hanged by Champ and his men. Although Champ acknowledged hearing about these hangings, he denied responsibility for them. His later statements to the press appear to have contradicted this. The following month, Ferguson sustained a life-threatening injury, taking a bullet to the abdomen during a skirmish with Federals. Although he survived, his disappearance for the next 3 months procured rumors of Champ dying from his injuries, or otherwise patently false newspaper reports of Champ being found and riddled by a number of Federal bullets as he lay wounded in bed. Ferguson continued to elude Federals, despite later sightings of him stealing more than 100 U.S. horses from their post oak pasture in mid-July. Ferguson then largely appears to have remained out of the Federals' way, retreating into the Kentucky mountains for the remainder of the summer. With federal forces continuing in their policy of offering no quarter to irregular soldiers, one of the most gruesome incidents of the war took place in late September of 1864 in Centralia, Missouri, at the hands of guerrilla leader William Bloody Bill Anderson and about 80 of his men. Although it is unlikely that Ferguson and Anderson ever crossed paths, their bloody legacies are often associated. After stopping a train while disguised in Union regalia, or uniforms, the guerrillas ordered the passengers to disembark and line up. Along with the civilian passengers were 23 unarmed Union soldiers on furlough from the Army. The men were reportedly ordered to strip to their underwear before having their uniforms confiscated. Anderson then asked for a sergeant from the group to step forward. Fully expecting to be executed, Sergeant Thomas M. Goodman volunteered. Instead of killing him, however, the guerrillas proceeded to murder all of the remaining unarmed soldiers, then proceeding to mutilate their bodies. They then set fire to the train and sent it flying down the rails to the next town. The Union Army launched a swift response to this massacre, only to present the opportunity for a second bloodbath. Later that same day, Anderson and his men were met by a mounted regiment of 155 Union soldiers under the command of Major Andrew Johnston. What ensued, the Battle of Centralia, was even more horrific than the murders they committed that morning. Armed with slow-loading Enfield rifle muskets, the inexperienced 39th Infantry were only able to fire a single volley before being set upon by Bloody Bill's men, who were armed with pistols. Despite their immediate surrender, Anderson and his men proceeded to mercilessly slaughter all 155 of the Union soldiers. Post-Civil War outlaw Jesse James, who was present among Anderson's men, claimed to have killed Major Johnston himself during this battle. Indeed, some of the most infamous American outlaws began their careers as guerrilla fighters during the war between states. According to Associate Professor of Civil War History, Dr. Barton A. Myers, Bloody Bill Anderson and his associates went on to earn their reputations for torture and mutilation, as they subjected Major Johnston and his soldiers to the most inhumane butchery on that grassy field. Major Johnston was murdered and scalped. 130 of his men shared this fate. Collection of body parts as trophies and saddle decorations was a common practice by many among guerrilla fighters, an environment that certainly permitted psychopaths to flourish. Those of their lucky victims were shot through the head before their corpses were desecrated. These and other men were either scalped, decapitated, bayoneted with their own rifles, some having their ears and noses cut off. Genitals were torn off and stuffed into the mouths of the dying. For these, among his other crimes, Union efforts doubled to track Anderson and his men down. Having witnessed the entire carnage, the sole Union survivor, Sergeant Thomas M. Goodman, called the scene a drunken carnival of blood. He was held captive for 10 days, possibly to be used in a prisoner exchange. On the evening of the 10th day, however, he managed to escape while the guerrillas were preparing to cross the Missouri River. A month after this massacre, Union fighters successfully launched an ambush. Anderson was shot in the head. Union soldiers then photographed Anderson's corpse and paraded it through the streets of Richmond, Missouri, in celebration. Like the notches in Champ's knife, Anderson was found carrying a piece of rope, which he used to keep track of his killings. It was reported to have 54 knots at the time of his death. Towards the end of the summer of 1864, Champ Ferguson appears to have rejoined the cavalry command of General Joseph Wheeler as the larger war moved southeast towards Georgia. Champ was not with General Wheeler more than a month before he was evidently arrested after what may have been a scrap with Confederate soldiers. Fighting between guerrillas and their formal military counterparts was not uncommon. Upon his release from confinement, Champ and his men were attached to the commands of Colonel George Debrell and General John Williams. Shortly thereafter, these Confederate commands were rerouted into Southwest Virginia in order to defend against a large incoming Union raid force. The Battle of Saltville, Virginia stands as a testament to Champ's mercilessness. Shortly following Bloody Bill's massacre at Centralia, Missouri, 600 miles away, DeBrell's command, comprised largely of some 300 untrained recruits, along with Champ and the other Confederate guerrillas, began setting up fortified positions to defend the nearby salt works on October 2nd. As fate would have it, the placement of Ferguson and his fellow Tennesseans put them directly facing the men of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry. Considering the war, for these men, was rooted deeply in racial issues, the oncoming battle would prove to be one of personal vendetta. The Federals managed to push the Confederate force back up the hill on which they had entrenched themselves. Evidently, as they saw the black soldiers climbing the hill towards them, Brian McKnight writes, William C. Davis described DeBrell's 8th Tennessee as becoming exasperated, and several let their irrational anger get the best of them and left the security of the entrenchments to fight a black man personally. Despite their vengeful distractions, the Confederates put up a determined resistance at the top of their hill, with the Federals running low on ammunition and withdrawing by 5 p.m. As he quotes much of the following eyewitness testimony in a clear and concise manner, the following is an excerpt from Brian McKnight's book regarding the aftermath of the battle. In the overwhelming majority of military battles, when the actual fighting draws to a close, the battle is considered over. At Saltville, the real crisis occurred the following morning, when Confederates roaming the battlefield reportedly began executing wounded enemy soldiers, most of whom were black troops. Although no individual soldier was named in the aforementioned accounts, at Champ Ferguson's trial in the summer of 1865, Henry Shocker of the 12th Ohio Cavalry placed the defendant on the field as an active participant in the slaughter. Shocker recalled, I saw Ferguson in the morning pointing his revolver down at the prisoners laying on the field. Understanding what was taking place, Shocker, who had been wounded the previous evening, crawled out of the path of the slowly approaching Ferguson, keeping quiet and probably feigning death. He heard Ferguson ask his wounded friend, Crawford Henselwood, What are you doing here? Why do you come down here to fight with the damn nurse? With that, Ferguson pulled out his pistol and asked Henselwood, Where will you have it? Back or in the face? Henselwood, now begging for his life, could not sway Ferguson. Having heard such pleas many times before, Ferguson shot the wounded trooper in mid-plea. Still playing dead, Shocker felt Ferguson walk past him and watched him go to a small log building nearby that was serving as a hospital. For several minutes, Shocker lost sight of Ferguson, and when two harmless-looking Confederates came near, the wounded Union soldier asked them if they would take him into the hospital. As the two soldiers neared the building with Shocker, Ferguson came out with two black soldiers. Wait and see what he does with them, commented one of the Confederate men. Shocker testified that Ferguson took the men several yards away and killed them with a revolver. He then returned to the hospital and took two more, whom he killed in a similar way. Brian McKnight continues, While some historians have sought to vindicate Ferguson, they have frequently done so based largely on speculation. William H. Gardner came to Virginia as a surgeon in the 30th Kentucky Infantry. Either captured by the enemy or left behind by his unit to treat wounded Federals, Gardner was inside the hospital doing his job when Ferguson came there with several armed men. The guerrilla then took 5 men, privates, wounded black soldiers, and shot them. Ferguson, however, was not finished with the Saltville fight. Long after dark on the night of October 7th, 4 days after the battlefield killings, Ferguson and several others ascended the stairs of nearby Wiley Hall on the campus of Emory and Henry College. The building had been converted to a hospital and was now serving those wounded prisoners who had been carried off the field. Orange Sells, a member of the 12th Ohio Cavalry, recalled 3 men burst into his room. With one holding a candle and the others carrying revolvers, they were clearly looking for someone specific. After looking at each prisoner's face, one of the men said, "There's none of them here," and left the room. Within seconds, Sells heard gunfire in the room next door and a black soldier wrapped in a sheet ran frantically into his room. Apparently still angered by his experience fighting black troops, Ferguson had found 2 wounded black soldiers on the 2nd floor and shot them in their beds. If a single person could be credited with sending Ferguson to the gallows, it would be Elza Smith, a lieutenant in the 13th Kentucky Cavalry. Smith, a relative of Ferguson's first wife, hailed from Clinton County, Kentucky. About 4 p.m., the day after Ferguson came to the hospital and killed 2 black soldiers, he returned with some of his men. Ordinarily, guards would be stationed at each stairwell to prevent escape attempts, but after the previous night's excitement, they were also on the lookout for incoming vigilantes. Attempting to climb one of the stairs, Ferguson was stopped by a Confederate guard. Dr. James B. Murphy, a Tennessean who was assigned to the hospital at Emory and Henry College, remembered that when the guard told Ferguson and the others they could not go upstairs, the guerrilla replied they would go up the steps in spite of him. Undeterred, the guard leveled his gun on the small group and warned them not to advance. Without knowing it, the guard, whom Murphy colorfully described as an Irishman as brave as Julius Caesar, had accomplished a rare feat by forcing Champ Ferguson to back down. Ferguson, still wanting to go upstairs but unwilling to fight for the chance, changed his tack. Leaving the Irish guard who was watching the stairwell at one end of the building, he and his men walked to the other end, where they ascended a second stairwell over the protestations of a less committed guard. On the 3rd floor, Ferguson found the man for whom he was apparently looking for. The badly wounded and perfectly helpless Lieutenant Smith was lying in a bed in a room with 2 other ailing prisoners. Orange Cells was in the room when Ferguson entered. Though seriously wounded, Smith recognized Ferguson and asked,
Champ, is that you?
Without a word, Ferguson approached the bed while pulling up a gun with one hand and hitting the breech with the other. Ferguson asked,
Smith, do you see this?
while leveling a weapon on the soldier. Smith begged,
For God's sakes, Champ, don't shoot me here. Please.
Pushing the muzzle of the gun to within a foot of Smith's head, Ferguson pulled the trigger 3 times before it finally fired. Sells watched as Ferguson and another man inspected the wound to make sure it was mortal before they left. He also noted that the intended victim was Captain Christopher Degenfeld, who had spent part of that spring chasing Ferguson and his men out of southern Kentucky. Ferguson reportedly demanded Captain Degenfeld and Colonel Hanson of the hospital authorities, but not knowing the former by sight, passed him without recognition, and before the opportunity returned again, the 2 intended victims had been slipped away into another building by the hospital authorities. Champ and his men's butchering of wounded men and prisoners after the recent battle, followed by their hospital murders, would go down in history as the Saltville Massacre. Evidently, upon hearing about these atrocities, Confederate General Robert E. Lee himself stated he was much pained to hear of the treatment the black prisoners are reported to have received, and agreed with entirely condemning it. Ferguson later denied culpability for any of these killings. However, Brian McKnight concludes, his presence on the battlefield as early as the day prior has been verified by several different sources who fought on both sides that day, and his activities after the battle are well documented. 1865. Having avenged himself, Champ Ferguson and his command then rejoined General Wheeler, following Union General Sherman's footsteps through Georgia and South Carolina. Around February 1st, 1865, Ferguson was ordered back to Wyethville, Virginia. He was then imprisoned for 2 months as Confederate authorities investigated the Saltville charges and his murder of Lieutenant Smith. Despite the Confederate Army's desire to prosecute him, Ferguson's status as an unofficial combatant presented issues. Efforts to investigate the Saltville killings were likewise hampered, with the investigation becoming less of a priority as the war entered into its final weeks. According to General Wheeler, a lack of witnesses was ultimately a deciding factor in Champ being acquitted and released on April 4th. 5 days later, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate army at Appomattox. The fighting continued for some time, however, spite of Lee's surrender, with Lincoln's assassination taking place only another 5 days later. Meanwhile, with some hard riding, Champ appears to have abandoned conventional military service, as he was soon back hunting Union men in Clinton County by the end of April. One of the first encounters was with his sworn enemy, Tinker Dave Beatty. Spotting him in Fentress County, as Beatty stopped for a meal at a friend's home, Ferguson and 5 of his men rode up and, guns drawn, arrested him. While transporting him along the road, Beatty suddenly spun his horse to the rear and rode for his life, taking 3 bullets in the escape. None of the wounds proved fatal. On the morning of either April 30th or May 1st, 1865, 2 brothers, Martin Van Buren Duval and L.W. Bug Duval, watched along with their friend, John Hurt, as Ferguson and more than a dozen of his men rode onto the Duval farm. John's brother Martin was inside the home. Approaching the 3 men outside, Ferguson ordered them to surrender and drop their weapons. Van Duval challenged his authority, asking for the company's identity. Along with the now deceased Alexander Huff, Bug and Van Duval, along with John Hurt, were also among the group of Unionists who had once captured Champ and attempted to force his enlistment into the Federal Army 3 years prior. In response to their defiance, Champ leveled his pistol and fired. His shot missed. Van and John then returned fire as Ferguson rode away to call his men for support. Bug was unarmed and fled down a nearby creek, while Van and John ran up a small hill to take a defensive position. Although Bug was captured, Ferguson surprisingly instructed his men not to hurt him. Champ then turned his attention towards the other 2 men. He later returned, politely asking Bug the names of the men he had just killed up yonder. One of Duval's sisters began berating the guerrilla as he reached the house. Champ defended his actions by replying, "They started it with me." Champ and his men then left the farm, taking a few animals from the stable and leaving the family to find and collect the 2 men's bodies. Considering he allowed Bug to keep his life following this encounter, it is speculated that if not for Bug simply being unarmed, revenge against these men may have been only part of Champ's motive. In any case, these were the last known killings that Champ was known to have committed before his surrender. By the first week of May, federal authorities were rounding up guerrilla commands in the Cumberland Mountains. Many were offered paroles for even their unofficial Confederate service, but federal commanders had a more loathsome opinion of Ferguson and his command, who had yet to surrender. On May 23, 1865, after negotiating with Colonel Blackburn, Champ Ferguson and his men surrendered under the same terms given to Generals Lee and Johnston. They were released under verbal parole and returned to their homes. What Ferguson did not realize before meeting with Blackburn was that the federal government had singled him out. Upon meeting Ferguson, Colonel Blackburn informed him that a number of previous dispatches had ordered that any attempt by him to surrender should be refused. As Champ had arrived to meet Blackburn, accompanied by a number of armed men, and refusing to surrender unless given assurances for his well-treatment and his parole, like the others, Blackburn consented to ask his commander for a reconsideration on Champ's behalf. However, as he accepted the terms of Champ's surrender, with Champ promising to end his fighting and remain at home until a decision was made, Blackburn reportedly warned him that
It is best not to trust us too far.
2 days later, shortly after midnight on May 26th, 5 federal soldiers arrived at Champ's farm in White County, Tennessee, and arrested him, tying him to his horse and taking him to Nashville for trial. His trial would last for months and would attract a great amount of national interest and media coverage. His trial at Nashville lasted from the 11th of July through the end of September. A long line of 43 separate witnesses appeared to testify against him, including family members of his victims and Tinker Dave Beatty himself. Ferguson admitted to killing many of the 53 for which he stood accused of murder. He further claimed to have killed over 100 men, insisting his conduct was done as a soldier's duty. The evidence against him was significant, with the Nashville Daily Press reporting dramatic events during the trial, such as that of Reuben Wood's daughter having witnessed her father's murder and the subsequent fight between the two men inside her home, standing up and screaming. She pointed to the scars on Ferguson's head, identifying the place where her father had hit Champ with his hatchet as he had violently fought with his old friend after being shot. Champ evidently winced as all eyes in the courtroom turned on him. As if the evidence of his wartime actions wasn't enough, the Confederate defeat, the uncovered conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, as well as the recent arrest of Confederate Major Henry Wirz, also on charges of war crimes, the murder and conspiracy to kill his prisoners, had aroused a desire for retribution in the minds of many Americans. Ferguson and Wirz soon became the focal point for these widespread hostilities. As if things could not get any worse, when the time came for Ferguson's defense, he could muster only a handful of character witnesses who actually turned up to defend him. He later cited this as cause for an unfair trial. One of these witnesses was his former commander, General Joseph Wheeler. According to Brian McKnight, however, having no experience with Champ prior to August 1864, the general could only testify that he had considered Ferguson an officer in the Confederate Army during the final phase of the war, whether or not official documentation existed. On September 26th, the jury found Ferguson guilty. On October 10th, general orders affirming his conviction and sentencing him to death by hanging were issued. Evidently, due to the increasing strain on the Ferguson family's relationship with Champ during the war, none of his relatives visited him while he awaited execution, except for his wife and daughter. Having taken office following Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson was delivered a number of letters, even from his own nephew James, Champ's prison guard during his trial, requesting clemency for Ferguson's conviction and death sentence. As President Johnson was previously Governor Johnson of Tennessee, the same man whom Champ had purportedly once accepted to kill for a $1,000 bounty, Johnson had received multiple letters recounting Champ's war record in real time during his tenancy as state governor. In any case, the president ignored the many requests to pardon or reduce Champ's sentence. A Cincinnati Commercial article from October 20th reads as follows. Champ Ferguson was executed at noon today at the penitentiary grounds just outside the city. He stood composedly on the drop some 20 minutes while the charges, specifications, and sentence were read by Colonel Shafter. He nodded recognition to several persons in the crowd and shifted his position in an impatient manner while the sentence was being read. To some specifications, he inclined his head in assent. To others, he shook his head. That about Elam Huddleston caused him to say, "I can tell it better than that." When the speaker read, to all of which the prisoner pleads not guilty, he said,
I don't now.
After a prayer by his spiritual advisor, he was then asked if he had anything to say before proceeding with the execution. He replied, "Nothing to say in particular, at all. No, I don't think I have." The noose was here placed around his neck, and then, for the first time, he gave signs of emotion, and his face blushed to a deep scarlet. The perspiration broke forth profusely from his face, and his lips closed with a convulsive quiver. The realization of his awful situation seemed to have flashed over his mind in all its fullness, overpowering his fortitude. Colonel Shafter wiped the sweat away, and the prisoner gradually recovered his equanimity. In his reference of the accounts by reporters with the Nashville Dispatch and the Louisville Daily Journal, Brian McKnight writes, after a touching prayer, a visibly moved Ferguson whispered to Colonel Shafter, asking him to take a handkerchief and wipe the tears from his face. While Shafter dried Ferguson's eyes, he spoke quietly. It is unknown what he said, but whatever it was, it lifted Ferguson's spirits. The Cincinnati Commercial article continues. For a moment or two, he seemed to be repressing an impulse to make fuller remarks. After a brief pause, he added,
I won't be sent to my family. I don't want to be buried on this soil.
After another pause, he continued in an excited tone.
Don't give me to the doctors.
I don't want to be cut up.
A short silence followed when the prisoner again spoke, pointing to his coffin.
I want to be put in that thing, taken to White County, where I can have my family around me. If I'd only had my way, I wouldn't have been here. Whenever you're ready, I'm done. My last request is to be sent away with my wife.
A white hood was then placed over his head. Through the cloth, Ferguson spoke his last words.
Good Lord, have mercy on my soul.
At 17 minutes to noon, the drop fell. Like a parasitic vine slowly robs the healthy tree of its vitality, the scattering of guerrilla fighting throughout the southern and northern territories ultimately served to cripple the Confederate Army, as nearing the end of the war, they struggled to recruit soldiers from the guerrilla ranks. Bushwhacker raiding had additionally left potential supplies, as well as Confederate civilian loyalties, diminished. According to Dr. Barton A. Myers, the majority of guerrilla fighters are now known for little more than obscurity, death, infamy, and criminality. Honor, glory, and fame are rarely prescribed to these otherwise unknown men, nameless, faceless, forgotten to history. In the years after the war, some guerrilla fighters, such as Jesse James, would find it difficult to return to normal life and carried on with their criminal careers. While Champ Ferguson's bloody war record appears to reveal him as a murderer who deserved his fate, many of his contemporaries were no better than he, including men on the pro-Union side, yet they escaped similar retribution. Dave Beatty admitted that he had taken up arms for the Union government without pay, which by definition made him a guerrilla. He reportedly committed similar cold-blooded murders, such as that of his brother-in-law, George Franklin, in the fall of 1864. According to Brian McKnight, whereas the Confederate defeat shined a bright critical light on Confederate guerrilla activities, the Union victory sanitized and sometimes obscured the actions of men like Beatty. Beatty and other guerrillas could very well have suffered the same fate as Ferguson. Clearly, a double standard was being applied. When pro-Union newspapers in Nashville covered the Ferguson trial, they referred to the defendant as the monstrous criminal and Beatty as the celebrated Union scout. To Champ Ferguson, the world was a simple place, consisting of either friends or enemies. The former was to be protected, and the latter to be eliminated at the first opportunity. To his end, he defended his actions as essential to his own survival. But was Champ's execution everything it appeared to be? The book, Champ Ferguson, Confederate Guerrilla, was published in 1942, authored by World War II Navy veteran Thurman Sensing. In the 1994 reprinted version, Sensing's son addresses some lingering questions in the book's afterword, questions which create a potential mystery surrounding Champ's execution. I thought I'd found Champ back in 1941, when my father and I went looking for him in that old graveyard on the Calfkiller River. Maybe I was wrong. According to a story I read in the Cookeville Herald-Citizen, there was a conspiracy between Champ and the military. The theory is that the military felt that Champ should not be hanged because many others as guilty as he had been paroled. The story is that the military enclosed the undersection of the scaffold and that a ring of soldiers completely encircled it. When the hangman cut the rope and Champ dropped through the trap door, they quickly untied the loose knot and placed Champ in the casket alive. The casket was then placed on a waiting wagon, which Champ's wife and daughter drove out of town. When they were out of Nashville, Champ climbed out of the casket, and the three rode to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, where they took new names and took up farming and ranching for a living. It's an interesting story, but if it's true, who is buried in the grave I found marked Captain C. Ferguson? With the name being misspelled on the headstone, are we to assume that his wife Martha didn't know how to spell his name? or that someone else in on the conspiracy misspelled it and put up a slab of limestone at a fake grave so that everyone would think Champ really had been hanged? What did Colonel Shafter whisper to Champ in a low undertone that made Champ's face light up noticeably? Did he tell him about the conspiracy and that he would be saved by the military? We'll never know. And the legend lives on.